covered in ink and bleach. Cross out the ones who heard my cries and watched me weep. I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright.
Yeah. Unknown Brain. Marvin Devine. I'm saying bye to all the lies and all the times you cried, saying that I wasn't right, yet I was right by your side. You manipulator, playing games, your friends commentators, and I don't know what you say about our private conversations, but it's got them hating. Thanks to all the rumors you be claiming, it's cool, I'm done with you, so they can throw you a celebration. You gon' hate it when you see me with somebody living better. I'm trying to tell you that me just doing me gon' have you jealous.
Gotta stay away from all your games, yeah. I know that I found somebody else to love you today. You'll realize the grass ain't greener on the other side, no. You did me dirty for the last time, so now I gotta say
the ground, don't get caught in the mosh pit. Fuel to the fire, ain't nobody can stop it. Trouble in my city, but you know I'm across it. Got a 40 on my hip and I'm liable to spark it. Throw down these hits, my click is indivisible. I aim, you duck, I squeeze, now you invisible. I'm not afraid of getting physical. All these different chemicals are fogging up my visuals. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Yo, we notorious, we ain't no runners. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Yo, we some warriors, they ain't gon' done us. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Put on my strap, put on the beat, put on the map, put on my team. Take out every motherfucker in between. Know what I mean? Better myself, better my aim, better my rap, better my name. Killing rappers on my hang on by their chains for the fame. Never thought I would it, now I'm running this. You don't wanna follow me, now I'm in front of this. I ran in the jungle with the truth, trying to get it what it does. Battling and I ain't never lose. We some motherfucking warriors. Cover the map and still ain't know where you can find me at. Journey through the mind of an insomniac. I ain't never sleep, staying ready, keep an eye out for the fakes. For the snakes, load a clip and I'ma pull it, something shakes. Never go to battle if you plan to lose. Life a game of chess, you gotta plan the moves. Middle fingers up, I'm not a fan of rules. Fighting for the right to live in peace and not like animals. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. You'll be notorious, we ain't no runners. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. These warriors, they ain't gon' cut us. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Bloods on my hands, got slugs on my gunners. Put on my strap, put on the beam, put on the map, put on my team. Take out every motherfucker in between. Know what I mean? Better myself, better my aim, better my rap, better my name. Killing rappers on my hang on by their chains for the fame. Never thought I would it, now I'm running this. You don't wanna follow me, now I'm in front of this. I ran in the jungle with the truth, trying to get it what it does. Battling and I ain't never lose. We some motherfucking warriors.
Caught up inside your self-righteous symphony.
Nope, there we go. Mic wasn't on. It's very, very sunny today in Brisbane. Welcome to PowerShell101Live. I'm just gonna kill that, and drop into a bit of a PowerPoint. Not that. Yeah. So welcome. Today's going to be really, really. I'm actually thinking we're going to probably go over time just because of the amount of content we're going to be covering. So I've split up advanced functions into two parts. The second part's kind of a element in itself. But anyway, yeah, welcome. I'm just going to hang around, make sure everyone can jump in. If you are in chat, just say g'day. I just want to make sure that everything's working, and if you can hear me, say g'day as well. Let me just quickly see if people can hear me. Say g'day as well. Cool. Alright. We are live and streaming and people can hear me. Sweet. So, yeah, welcome to 101 Live. Today we're going to be like I said, we're going to be covering functions and advanced functions. Um, and we're going to, yeah, we've got a few demos to go through fairly in depth um, talk today. So, this is going to be a pretty intense one. Let me just flick the screens. So, quick recap. So again, we're just going to do a quick recap of what we covered previously. Just obviously same things. I'm going to pretty much breeze through this because I'm going to pretty much need all the time I can possibly get for functions. So following that, we're going to have functions in PowerShell. So we're just going to be looking at what functions are, a few demos, all that kind of bit jazz. We're going to have an intermission of 5 minutes so that everyone can kind of have a bit of a break from the overload. And then we're going to step into advanced functions. Now, this is going to be probably a part one of a part two. So part one is just going to be covering commandlet binding predominantly and the begin, process, and end blocks. Part two is going to be focusing on the actual parameters and the attributes that you can assign to those parameters. So essentially, we're just going to have a two-parter for advanced functions because there's a lot there to cover, and there's a lot of demos that we'll need to go through to do that. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing today. So like I said, some homework for you guys. Obviously, you've kind of had a bit of a sneak peek of the first point and the second point with the code to actually build a VM in Client Hyper-V. So yeah, so build a VM in Client Hyper-V. We have touched on that code, so that part is already done for you. If you can find the code, it's on the OneDrive. I'm just gonna while I'm doing that, I'm just gonna quickly share the OneDrive link. This is, you can just jump on there, get all the slides, all the jazz, all that good stuff. So let me just drag that across. What am I going to? I'm going to Discord. Where is the notebook? There it is. So I'm just going to check that in. So that's just the OneDrive link. For the slides, all the bits and pieces, you can jump on there, take a look at it. It's read only, so definitely have a look at it. It's all good. So from that, yeah. So obviously, I'll just quickly jump back in. Automate the following. So essentially, what we're going to be doing, what you need to do for your homework. And this is not, obviously I'm not going to check or anything like that, it's just kind of good for you guys to just practice what you've learned, is basically build a VM, install Windows 10, install OBS Studio version 24, I think we're on version 24 point something, we're on a different build, so latest version essentially, and then install Visual Studio Code. So that should be fairly straightforward. I know that, for example, .4 is really easy as well, so yeah, so that's actually what we've got. That's what we've got as a bit of a task. I've set for a task for you guys. It's simple enough to kind of get you guys started. At the same time, though, it's yeah, it's there. Also, if you want to check out any of the previous PowerShell 101 Live. Just see if I can find this YouTube video. Oh, the YouTube. We are simulcasting to YouTube, so essentially, we can have a quick squiz. Just want to see if this is the one. Yeah, so essentially, in here, PowerShell 101 Live. So, this is the entire series that we've been going through. So, of the entire stream series, so you can just jump in here and get stuck into it. As you can see, they're about 2 hours a pop, so I'm just going to place that in there, so you guys have that. Sweet. So anyway, so let's get stuck into it. So quick recap. Quality operators. I am going to be these are the ones I'm going to be continually recap on, just because of the level of it's always good to just have them ingrained. So obviously, PowerShell's case-insensitive matching by default. So A is equal to A, that's going to return true. Not equals, obviously not equals operator, equals operator. Greater than 2 is greater than 1, that's obviously going to return true. 1 is less than true, that's going to return true. Greater than or equal to, 2 is greater than or equal to 1. It's also, that's the same, that'll also equate to be true. And obviously the same here, so that's 1 is less equal to 1 will also equate to be true. So that's pretty straightforward. Where object is used to filter input from the pipeline. Obviously you can use the alias $where, and obviously there's your definitions. So essentially you can use input, you can use collection, and you can pipe to a script block expression, or alternatively you can just specify a property and then the condition and value. So that's pretty much where object. Syntax operators. So obviously you've got grouping expression operators, sub-expression operators. So grouping expression operators allow you to group specific conditions together. So you can have 1 is equal to 1 and 2 is not equal to 1. So essentially think something like that, and you can basically, it will evaluate the deepest grouping expression first and then back it out. So very handy for that. Sub-expressions are used to you can do run code inside of a variable. So essentially you can have a variable var, and then you can basically have a sub-expression, and this is really used so you can actually write code inside of here. So the code. So essentially that's pretty straightforward. Static member operators, static.NET methods, things like that. That's basically denoted by the double colon. And call operator basically runs a command. So basically is it will run the PowerShell. So it will run PowerShell from a string. So essentially you could have a string here saying get item, I'm just going to get a GCI, so get child item, and then basically as a string, and then if you AND it, it will execute it. Format operator, same thing, you can format a string, that's pretty straightforward. And then dot source. So dot sourcing essentially allows you to run a script within the current scope. We're going to talk a little bit about scopes today. So let's go to the next slide. So automatic variables, they basically used by PowerShell to actually just store state loss, to store information about the state of PowerShell. So the PowerShell build info, is it Windows, is it Mac OS, is it Linux, things like that. So that's what an automatic variable is. They're read only. PowerShell tokens are special characters. So tokens basically a segment of PowerShell PowerShell of comment text. So essentially, write host. If we look at write host, it splits into 2 tokens. You've got the first token, which is write host, and the second token is hello world. Obviously, $_ is current object in pipeline. $$ is the last token from the last command. Special characters are denoted by in a string to represent special characters. So they're denoted by a backtick, with the exception to percentile negative. And essentially what that does is, with the exception to that one, you have backtick tab, backtick A, alert speaker. This one it ignores all other special characters after it, so things like that. Preference variables, these are hard-coded to control the behavior of PowerShell, very straightforward. So essentially you can set specific preference variables to do different things. We're going to be looking today at the confirm preference. So we're going to be playing around with that today, because we're going to be using commandlet binding. So yeah, so essentially a good one is you obviously got error action preference, warning preference, information preference. These are the most common ones. and you can you can set specific behaviors from that. So those behaviors can be whether to suppress, whether to prompt, things like that. So terminating non-terminating errors. So terminating errors is basically it's an error that stops a statement from running. So usually exceptions, but that's not technically the case because you can still have exceptions raised as a non-terminating error. It just really depends. So essentially, if it's not handled, PowerShell will stop the running script function pipeline. So essentially, it'll pass it up the handler until it can potentially get handled. If it doesn't get handled, it will stop. Non-terminating error is just the equivalent of that, not doing that. So that's pretty straightforward. So try catch finally. So use try catch finally to do handle terminating errors. So basically the way it works on the hood is a terminating error is raised in the try block. Errors added to the error variable. PowerShell searches for the catch block with exception type. So you can actually have specific exception types. And then the finally block is executed. Obviously, you don't necessarily need to have a catch block if you don't need to catch anything. You can just have a try and finally, and vice versa. So you can actually have a try catch. You don't necessarily need the finally block. Those can be used optionally interchangeably. They can be used interchangeably. PowerShell's output streams. So obviously success output is what was introduced in 2. You have the error, which was introduced in 2, so that's the error stream. You have the warning, verbose, debug, information stream. These are introduced in 5. Oh, sorry, 3. This was introduced in 3, and information stream was introduced in 5. So you can do write information and it'll push to the screen. Had a moment this week with my coworkers saying this is not working, write information, and it was because he actually was running on a 2012 SBC, so essentially it wasn't going to work because it was running PowerShell 4. It needed to run 5. So we don't really need to go through questions. If you've got questions, you can just throw them in the chat. But at the end of the day, though, we're just going to pretty much fly through that. Essentially, if you've obviously have any other outstanding questions from previous videos, you obviously can throw them in chat as well. That's completely fine. Functions in PowerShell. So we're just going to have a quick overview of what functions is. It's going to be fairly heavily theory based. There are still a lot of practical, there's going to be a fair bit of practical demos, so we're going to be doing a few demos, but essentially it's still going to be theory based. An overview. So essentially, basically a function is really just a group of PowerShell statements that has a name associated with it. So the statements are executed by calling that name. Functions behaved really like commandlets. So functions to actually return something to the caller or the parent. Functions you can either use the return or the write output. Realistically, the reason why you do that is essentially you can it just means that you can obviously simplify your code. So the biggest thing with functions is you want to reduce the complexity of your code. You want to make it more maintainable. And so rather than having multiple lines or multiple PowerShell statements in several places, it actually makes more sense just to combine them and then have that as a function. Functions also are very, very handy with testing. So when we're going to be looking at testing and how to actually write our functions to be more testable and things like that, it's really, really, really good because essentially it means that we can group our code into specific segments, and that means that it makes it much easier to test as well. But essentially it's just really there to reduce complexity of code, making it more maintainable. So rather than having, multiple statements that you copy and pasting over and over again, you can just simplify that into a single function. So basically we have our basic function definition. So this is your super basic function definition. You have a function statement, and then after that you declare a name, so the name of the function, and then from that you would have your statement list within here. And that's pretty much the most basic function you can potentially have. Obviously there are advanced functions, so we are going to obviously be building on this this framework. So essentially, to call a function, you can call a function by specifying its name. So for example, we've got a function here called start test process. Obviously, there's nothing inside it. It's just an empty script block there. And we call it by basically calling start test process. That is really it. Now you can see why we did make the comment previously that it behaves like commandlets. We're going to actually, you can actually make it a lot more commandlet-like using advanced functions, but essentially basic functions still behave essentially like a commandlet. So that's pretty much in terms of super basic functions. So what we're going to do is we're actually just going to jump out, jump into the demos. So let's have a look at our demos. Just make sure that everyone can see my code. Is that readable? I might just increase it. Okay, cool, sweet. So we just got a basic function demo here. So what we've got here is we've just got our basic function. So essentially, you can see we've got our function statement, and we've got our function name, and then we've declared a parameter block, which is basically denoted similar to a method. But essentially, we actually don't even need that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that, and we're going to bring that down here, and I'm just going to quickly refactor this code because I want to show you that you don't even need this. So essentially, you can just have a basic function like so, and we can call it. So let's run this and load this function into memory. So I've just ran and loaded in memory, and let's go ahead and call it. And you can see we've called it by running basic function. So we can run that again. Like so, and we can see we've actually executed the statements within it, and we have a write output of hello world. Essentially, that is your a stock standard basic function. You also don't need to have a parentheses, a parameter, a grouping expression. So it's just not needed. So you can do the same thing. Most people generally write their functions like so in terms of the formatting. It does the exact same thing, but essentially just for obviously for coding purposes, you don't need it. I generally tend to move. Oops, close that. I generally tend to move towards this kind of approach, just because at the end of the day, this really comes down to how I lay out my parameters. It's just not needed. There's no point to have it, so there's no point. Just don't use it. So within it, you can actually have. I'm just seeing if we have. Okay, we're talking about PowerShell Scopes. Okay, so one of the things that before we go any further, I just want to make sure that. Okay, cool. They're parameters. Sweet. So we've done that first demo. So essentially, what we're going to do now is, oops, wrong one. We're going to talk about scopes. So scopes. The reason why scopes are very, very important to talk about is because people will get confused, especially within functions. Functions generally tend to cause a bit of havoc when it comes to scopes. So PowerShell Scopes, I want to talk about PowerShell Scopes before we talk about functions. So we're going to kind of take a bit of a step back first. So essentially, PowerShell Scopes PowerShell Scopes were developed to protect the access to variables, aliases, functions, and PS drives. So essentially, what it really simplified as a simple expression, it allows you to have I'm just trying to think of a really easy way to say it. Protects access. They say it protects access to variables, functions, and PS drives. Essentially, what it means is that you can have different. You can allocate different scopes within script blocks. Within a script block or any sort of nested piece of code. The variables within that are not accessible. Nah, that doesn't make sense. Just trying to think of a really easy way to explain this. It's basically just memory protection. I think that's the easiest way to describe it. It's just memory protection. So you can have nested code that can't change variables in parent code. That's probably the easiest way to. It's just memory protection. So essentially, what we have here is scopes can nest. So there's three rules that apply within PowerShell scopes. So the first one, scopes can nest. So what I mean by that is essentially, if I bring out my pen, we've got our parent code here. We can have a script block here, and we can have our own vars in here. Equals blah. That's supposed to be a H, sorry. Essentially, scopes can nest. So what that means is this variable is not accessible. Sorry, this variable is nested from this variable up here. Yeah, so it's nested from this variable up there. So essentially, you can have the same variable in different nested blocks. So essentially, you can have nested script blocks here, and then that variable only applies to that specific nested script block. From that, you have. I think this is going to be much easier to demo. So essentially, you have items cascade into child scopes unless set to private. So what this basically means is if I have a script block up here, and I have a variable up here, let's say above the script block, the variable actually will cascade into the child scope, into the child script block. And essentially what that means is you can reference variables from the parent. However, you can't change them. These are read only. So that's another rule. And then items change within the scope change where they were created. So what I mean by that is, so if I create a variable up here in my parent, and let's call it 1, and then we have a nested script block down in here, and I change var to be 2, it will only apply within this script block here. So essentially, var, when you return to the parent, var will still equal to 1. Now there are ways to get around that, but essentially these are the rules that apply. So there are really, we're going to talk about the 4. I'm just making sure I can count. Actually, the 5 local is technically 1. Actually, no, they're 4. Private's not really a scope. So essentially, you have different scopes that you can declare variables as. So for example, if I declare a global scope variable, essentially what can happen is that variable or that function or whatever will essentially, that item will essentially remain in effect while PowerShell is active. Now you have local variables, local items. We're just going to use variables, for example. And so that's basically, it pertains to its current scope. You have script. Script is only, the item is only in use while the script is running. Once the script is terminated, it doesn't exist anymore. Then you have the private. Private's not really a scope override. Or a scope variable. Essentially what it means is you can actually declare it to change the visibility. So what that means, the change the visibility outside its current scope. So essentially what that means is if you have a parent variable, a variable declared in a parent scope. Let's just call it, we'll just go P for private, and we'll just call the variable A. A is only accessible within that scope. So if you have a child scope, it's just it will not cascade. So yeah, that is pretty much private. So it's only within its current scope. When we demo this, it's going to make it so much easier to demo. Essentially, then we're going to be using the, then we have the using. There are some other ones, but I'm just going to quickly talk about, we're going to just stick with using. So using is basically used to access variables in other scripts. So you use using within start job invoke command. That's really the only time you're going to use it. We're not going to be looking at using as a demo today. We're going to be really mainly focusing on scope itself. So let's quickly jump into back to demos. Let's have a quick look at it. So the first thing we're going to do is get our. I'm just trying to work out where I need to actually look at this. PowerShell Scopes. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about cascading scopes first, and then we'll go to the other ones. So essentially here we have we've got a demo of a cascading scope. So I've got a function here called PowerShell Scope Demo, and we're writing the output of var. And we're actually having in a parent scope, which, since remember, a function is a child scope. It's a child script block, which means it's in its own scope. So essentially we have a var declared up in a parent scope, because it's in the parent script, called never going to give you up. So what we're going to do is we're going to run this, and we can dump out var, so we can see that var is returning never going to give you up. And what we're going to do now is we're going to call PowerShell Scope Demo. If it actually, did I run it? I did. Yep. So now if I run PowerShell Scope Demo, you can see it returns the parent. It returns the parent variable. Now what I'm going to do is we're actually going to, so that's essentially the cascading rule. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you this again, except we're going to overwrite the variable. So essentially here we're going to have a quick go back to the, so obviously we can see the first rule here. We'll talk quickly first. We'll come back to the first rule, but essentially what we saw here was the second rule, which was items will cascade into child scopes unless set to private items. And now we're going to demo the third rule. Am I Devops? Devops is a really big global. It's such a generic term. So DevOps is generally, if you look at the role of DevOps, DevOps is really used for automating a CI pipeline. So we're talking about automating continuous integration delivery. I don't do DevOps as per se. I do, like, that is not my role. My role is more automation. So I'll automate specific business processes, things like that. So when people talk about DevOps, obviously we're talking about the actual delivery of a software product. Now, I can build CI, and I do have CI/CD pipelines and things like that as part of my role. So, for example, I have a PowerShell module at work which we deploy to our clients, and essentially there is a CI/CD process in place. So I will do DevOps and to automate the build process of that and facilitate it to do automated testing and things like that. But essentially, that is not my role in this sense. So it's a facet of my role, but it's not all my role. I don't just do CI/CD pipelines. Anyway, so essentially, you have, obviously, scopes can nest. So we're going to come back to that one, but I just want to quickly demo this one, which is essentially items change within the scope. So what we have here, so this is the third rule. So we're going to change the variable. So we still got this variable declared. I'm just going to redeclare it. Actually, I'm just going to quickly. So essentially, what we're going to have here is we're going to rerun this function. We're going to redeclare it. And what we're going to do is call it again. Now, what we're going to see is PowerShell Scope Demo. So you can see that it's returned when we've run it. It's returned never going to let you down. var in the parent is still never going to give you up. That is still set as never going to give you up. But because we've modified the variable in the child scope, essentially it's only going to pertain to the child scope. It's not going to pertain to the parent. Now there's ways to get around that. We'll talk about that soon. But essentially that's rule number 3. Rule number 1 is essentially this in general. So the function itself is executed in its own scope. So the function has it's able to obviously all the variables, all the item, so all the variables, all the items that pertain in the parent scope will cascade into the child scope. But essentially, the child scope is essentially it's a function. So that's really your rule number one. So I'm actually going to quickly show rule number one, which is rule number one, parent. Now, one thing I do want to quickly touch on with regards to this does not apply to jobs. And so jobs is a little different. So when we're using a using statement, so if you're using PowerShell jobs are executed within its own PowerShell run space, aka its own PowerShell process. Think of it as its own process. It's technically, because it's in its own process, it really is just a separate instance of PowerShell. So you can't really say that scope doesn't apply there in that sense. So what you do in those situations is you use the using statement and you pass into it, but essentially you're just executing PowerShell in its own run space. So it's completely separate. It's not in its current run space. It's basically just going PowerShell.exe and then running your own code. So that's just something to be mindful of. So like we said here, this is rule one. You got our parent scope. This is our parent script. Let's just think of this as our parent script. Anything within a function is it's basically a child scope. That also applies to script blocks as well. Now the question is, does that apply to variables or sub-expressions? I actually don't know. I actually haven't tested it. This applies. So essentially, if you see script block, it just you are basically executing within its own scope. Now, one of the really cool things is that, and this is where we're going to kind of break everybody's minds for a second. When we're using PowerShell modules, and modules is not going to be something we're going to cover in this course, so you don't really have to worry about it, but it's just something that's worth mentioning. PowerShell modules, when you have a module and you're calling a commandlet, when you build a module, behind the scenes you're going to have functions. There's going to be functions of code that you're going to be reusing over and over again. Now this is not a commandlet, this is a function. We're going to talk, that's something that's going to be quite explicit when we use a module. But essentially when we're basically when we're using a module, so let's say we're referencing a command, let's say get child item or get process, for example, and then there's a function within that is used by the module generically. So if you've got a module, for example, of let's say the module is called file info, and you have the two commandlets is get child item and get item, for example, there's going to be functions in there that you're going to be generically reused. Those functions are only accessible within the scope of the commandlet. So what that means is essentially you just can't call that function out of the module, outside of the module. So what I mean by outside the module, I mean in the actual PowerShell console itself or any sort of subsequent scripts. The functions are only accessible within the commandlet itself. So that's really important, especially when you're trying to work out, when you're trying to do things within PowerShell modules. So if you want to go, oh, I want to, try and do this, grab this function from another module, you're going to have to start messing around with scopes. So essentially, scopes is really, really important, and it's really good to understand that it basically, essentially, it applies to any sort of script block. So when you have a script block being executed, there's a scope being applied. So we've obviously looked at rule number one, which is parent scope, child scope. Then we basically we've looked at rule number two, which is essentially showing that we can cascading values. So essentially, var will cascade into the child scope, which is our function called PowerShell Scope Demo, and rule number 3, which is show function changing child scope. Essentially, we can change the function, but it's only going to apply to this scope, which is basically the script block. So essentially, we can see what will happen here is it will change it, but the parent variable won't change. So we can actually rerun this again so you guys can see. I'm just going to dump out var so you guys can see. So essentially we can run this. And you can see, let's call PowerShell Scope Demo. You can see it's going to return never going to let you down. So it's set never going to let you down. It's going to basically write output. But if we actually call var again, you can see it's actually the inheritance applies. So essentially never going to give you up is going to is going to be the variable. Because this is child, it can't change that. Now, that being said, it can. Oh man, PowerShell, full of contradictions. There's ways to obviously overwrite that. So what we did when we talked about obviously these special variables. These are the variables that you can use to actually overwrite scope. So you can declare those specific variables to actually override it. So we're going to talk about, we're going to look at all these except using. So let's take a look. So what we've got here, the first one is I wanted to show you the private. So remember, the private is basically a declaration to change the visibility outside its scope, which basically means it is only accessible within the current scope that it's running. Since the current scope right now is our PowerShell, essentially it's a PowerShell executable, what it means is it's only accessible to that. If we have a function and we try and access that variable from a function, which is its child scope, it is not going to be accessible because we've explicitly put the private there. Now, the way that we declare variables is we basically obviously have our dollar prefix, and what we're going to do is, and then we basically declare the type. So in this instance, it'll just be private, and then we denote it by a colon, and then the variable name, and that's it. So let's go ahead and run this. So we can see if we try and run PowerShell Scope Demo now, nothing's going to come out. It'll be completely null because there's nothing. It cannot access that specific variable because it's set to private. And as you can see there, nothing came back. So essentially, this is really handy for those when you really want to control the scope. Other ones is obviously creating local scope variables, same name as the parent scope. So essentially here we have, we could actually go ahead and create a child or a locally scoped variable. So let's go ahead and run this. So you can see this is a private still. And if we go ahead and copy this in, oops, I'm just going to F8 that in. Essentially, if we run this, we're going to get this is a local variable back. So you can still declare the variable, but it's only going to apply to that scope, which is going back to rule number 3, which is, where's rule number 3? Is items changed within the scope change when they were created. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put these rules in here. It makes it a bit easier so we don't have to jump back and forth. Now, one of the things I really quickly want to mention as well, when we talked about scopes can nest, this is actually something it quickly came to mind. This is I'm just going to call this nested child scope. This is the definition of a nest. So essentially, you can nest a function within a function, within a function, within a function, within a function, and that scope will only apply to that function. So you can basically, you can essentially nest. That's actually something I totally forgot to mention, which is important. All right, so we've talked about we've talked about showing locally created local scope variable, and now we're going to actually set the script. We're going to actually start overriding things. So what we got here, okay, I'm just looking at my notes. So what we got here is we're going to create a script variable. So down here we have var, this is a script variable. So if we go ahead and run this, I'm just going to return here. Okay. So essentially, I'm just going to put return statements there so that I can force the script to stop before doing anything. And what we're going to do now is we're going to quickly stop this. We're going to quickly jump in here. What we're going to do is we're going to actually run the script so we can actually see what it's doing. So I'm just going to open up PowerShell. Where's my PowerShell? Open PowerShell window from here. Oh, it's 5.1. Well, that's changed. I just updated PowerShell on the latest preview. Oh, I don't want Visual Studio. Oh, now we're gonna wait. And there was a right-click association added in Explorer, and it's kind of disappeared. I want to. Now, the reason why we actually need to show this in PowerShell itself, rather, I'm just going to run PowerShell like so. The reason why we need to show it in PowerShell itself and not the actual IDEs, so like in ISE or Visual Studio Code, is because it doesn't it does things a little differently. So it's not essentially a true representation. So this is really going to be a true representation of what's showing scope execution. So I'm just going to quickly. Oh, that's the wrong one. No, that's the wrong one. PowerShell101Live 7 demos. Here we go. Change directory. There we go. Sweet. So if we go run basic, we're going to go ahead and run basic function demo. So you can see here, we've basically run this piece of code. This is a script variable. We've declared that variable as a script variable. We've written a host just so we can see it, and then we've returned. So if I actually call var, it's null. And the reason why it's null is because, remember, a script variable, a script variable scope is only in use while the script is running. So you can see here, the script has stopped running, and then it's no longer in use. So that's basically a script variable. So what we're going to do is I'm going to comment that down, and we're going to see a global. So globals basically persist while the actual script is running, also while the PowerShell window is active. So if we go ahead and rerun that script again, you can see here again, this is a global variable, but now if I call var, you can see it's returned because it's a global variable, persists until the PowerShell window is closed. So that essentially is a global variable. So let's go ahead and comment all that out. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to show a quick demo on, actually I can go ahead and just remove all that. We don't need to go ahead and we can actually remove our comment blocks. So essentially we can actually go ahead now and show you how to modify a parent scope variable. So essentially here we're declaring a script variable called var, right host var, and then we're actually going to update that variable. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm actually specifying the script scope type, and then the variable name, and then the update to the variable. So if we go ahead and run this, just quickly clear the screen, like so, you can see here we're going to just quickly stop for a second so everyone can kind of articulate what's happening. So I'm just going to quickly drag this up. So what we've got here is we have outside the script. So this is obviously the first printout here. Then we're basically inside the variable. So we're actually updating the variable. So then we're going to basically, oh, what is it doing? That should be outside the script. Really? Ah, it also helps if I call it. So what we're going to do is let me just redo this because I kind of messed my own demo up. Call the function dummy. So what we're going to do here is we're outside our script. Let's just clear the screen. So we're outside the script. Now we're going to call this function. We're just going to bring this function into memory, and we're going to call it. So basically, the function is going to update that variable again. So if we run that, we can see that it hasn't returned anything because it's just updating a variable. And now if we actually reprint it, you can see it's returned inside the variable. So we've actually changed the variable in the parent scope. So we've broken that rule, but essentially that's how you can get around that rule. So if you do need to do it, you can. It's not generally recommended to go around and messing around with it. So essentially try and build your code to not require those changes. So essentially, you'd be returning and then updating it on the return. So essentially you do something like this. You would do something like this. You would have a function. Let's declare the function, say the return without changing scope. And so essentially what we can do here is go write output. Change the scope without. So essentially what we can do here then is when we actually have, let's say we have a var, a variable here called test, we can then, rather than actually changing it within here, we can just basically call it and then reset the variable. So that's an easier way of doing it. So if we run this, you can see if we call var again, it's changed. So that's a better way to do it rather than actually setting a script block. So that's the recommended way of doing it. All right. The final thing we're going to talk about, and this is one I was talking about a little bit earlier about module scopes. So essentially when you have a module, when you have a function in a module, the module commandlet is the only thing that can access that function. Now to get around that, we can actually specify scopes on our functions. So remember, we can set it on our functions, our aliases, our drives, variables, and variables. Yeah. So essentially, if we go ahead and run this again, you can just call basic function, and essentially when PowerShell loads that into memory, it's accessible by everything. So you can have another module, go ahead and run that. Not the best idea, but obviously there's situations when you need that. I've recently come off the back where I wrote a whole bunch of helper functions for the PS framework that I need to actually I needed to do some interpolation with. So essentially it's really handy when you need it. Now that's pretty much it in terms of scopes. So yeah, if you got any questions, throw them in. We can definitely come back and revisit it, because I do think it's going to be something that it's a bit challenging to begin with. Naming standards. So essentially, when running PowerShell, writing PowerShell functions, try and call your functions with the verb noun naming standard, PowerShell naming standard. So essentially, for more information about scopes. Oh, g'day Christian. I actually didn't even know you were online. So when talking about, I'm just going to grab this link because it's really quite handy. So oh, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. Where is it? No, down. Okay, cool. So essentially, naming standards. You try and call your functions according to the best practices set by PowerShell. So essentially, that's your verb noun prefix. Oh, your verb noun naming PowerShell naming standards. So verb prefix noun. So for example, if you're doing some sort of if you want to, like, a good example is if you want to get something, you're obviously going to use get hyphen blah. If you want to do add, use add. So I've just chatted in the link there the whole approved verbs. So there's a lot, and don't use any verb. Make sure you use an approved verb. And the reason why is because it just makes it easier to understand. So a good example is if you wanted to, like, this is just a quick summary of the of that link that I've just attached. Essentially, we have add and clear. So you can see here, for any action, do not use verbs such as append, attach, concatenate, or insert. Just use add. Or flush, erase, release, unmark, unset, nullify. Just use clear. It helps everyone articulate what's going on because they know that these are the approved verbs, and you just don't have random verbs out there. It's a good standard to follow. So we're just going to quickly have a look at that, like so. And as you can see here, there's a lot. So you've obviously got new versus set. Then you can basically scroll down here. You can see add, clear, close, copy, enter, exit, find, format, get, hide, and the list goes on. You can see in there, it just keeps going on. So it's really, really important to follow the standards, because by following the standards, it makes everybody's lives easier. Yeah, cool. That's all right. Sweet. So so that's pretty much your naming standards. It's pretty straightforward. Yeah, check out the link. That really helps you, and just use approved naming standards. It just makes things so much easier. Function parameters. So one of the things that we actually didn't, I kind of jumped the gun on, is parameters. Obviously, we talked about parameters in PowerShell. Obviously, there are function parameters, which is essentially the same as parameters. So basically, function parameters allows you to specify inputs to achieve the desired output. It's just like the whole DVD player button thing we talked about before. So essentially, in PowerShell, you can have arguments and parameters. Now, generally speaking, this is technically a parameter. So they kind of say args, some say parameters. This is the way that they say it. So essentially, you can have arguments and parameters. So essentially, an argument's a single token. So the whole old school way of doing command prompt, where you'd have an argument. Parameters are basically multi-tokens. So for example, you've got obviously your key and then your value. Now your value obviously can be a string when it can basically have spaces within it. That's where args is going to break down, because args are basically a single token. So essentially, if you had C program files, and obviously program space files, it'll be an arg would be C program. I'm not going to fully write that out. And then files, program space files, and then obviously the second one would be files. So this would be one set of args. Actually, this would be one set of args, and this would be one set of args. So that's the old school way of doing it. It's just easy to use parameters. So I'm not even going to really say use args, because you don't really need to use it. It's not really applicable. It's good to know, but it's just not really applicable. So essentially, parameter names obviously denoted by the hyphen. So yeah. So basic parameters definition. So you can see there's two types of ways we can declare parameters within functions. We can have our first type, which is basically our function name. So we declare a name, and then we've got the curly, we've got a grouping expression, and essentially within here we can basically have a whole bunch of different variables that we can declare with type, and essentially they're just parameters. That's one way we can do it. The second way, and this is really the recommended way of doing it, so is basically using the param, we call the param statement. And essentially what this does is we can declare our parameters within here, and there is a reason why, because we can actually do a ton more stuff with this specific statement versus this one. So we can basically, this is definitely the recommended way of doing things. So you can specify a parameter block and then your parameters. Now there's a whole bunch of attributes we can, the reason why is because we can build attributes into it. We can actually do many different things. We can have validations, and we can run PowerShell in there to validate, is this the right is this, you know, is this the correct input? If we can do things like we can set parameter names, we can do yeah, the list is pretty much endless. This is the better way of doing it, this one down here. So definitely recommend using this one. But nevertheless, we definitely want to demo both. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to basic demo. Just quickly going through scopes. Okay, perfect. Here we go. Parameters. So essentially, we've got parameter here. So you can see here, this is the first type of the parameter here, which is basically the default. Well, this is the default go-to, which essentially is you just got the grouping expression and the parameter name, and then we can write output. So essentially, we can call it with or without the optional parameter. It's all optional. So essentially, we can call it basic function hello world. So if we go ahead and run this, bring this into memory, and then we actually run it, you can see it's printing out hello world because we passed it in. So that's your basic one. Now we can actually also use the parameter name as well. So if we actually go basic function, and you can actually tab it out if I actually specify the hyphen, and you can see that there's param1, and we can also do the same thing. And I'm just going to change it just so you know that when there's no shenanigans happening, and you can see it returns this as me. So essentially, you can specify the parameter. It's all optional. The second way is use the param statement. So essentially here, we're going to relaunch this. We're going to load that into memory. We have our function. So param1 hello world. So it's the same process. So we can actually go rerun that. It's hello world. Let's just change this to this is me. Go ahead and run that. And again, you can return this as me. Now the reason why is this one is you can do a lot more stuff with it than this one can potentially even dream of. And so it's really useful. And just to show you an example, like you obviously don't need to fully understand it, but we can kind of just briefly go over it. Let me just open up a script. Get this is what I mean. So we can basically do a ton of extra stuff with it. It is very in depth. You can see here there's lots of different information we can actually do with it. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's even more that we can do with it. So that's the reason why it's recommended to use the param statement. That's basically parameters. So before we go any further, because we're actually now going to do a bit of a scenario, does anybody have questions? If we need to revisit scopes, we can. That's totally fine. We've got a little bit of time. I am running a tiny bit late, so we're going to see how we go. Alright, what we're going to do now is let's jump into, while you guys, if you've got any questions, just start firing them through. What we're going to do now is we're going to do our scenario. So essentially what we had was a scenario is, in the previous lessons we had a I wrote a URL script, a Google URL script. It basically hit google.com, enumerated all the links, went to those links and enumerated all those links and returned it into a nice object. So what this scenario wants us to do is we need to convert that URL script into a basic function. We're going to add basic parameters to include other URLs. This function should now be able to query any domain name. So we should be able to plug in yahoo.com. So what we got here is this is the script that I wrote previously in another stream in a previous lesson. So let's go ahead and copy this, and we're going to actually put this inside a function. So the first thing we're going to need to do is work out what we're actually going to call it. So I think what I'm going to call it is get URL links. So what we're going to do is we're just going to firstly paste that code in there. So let's go ahead and do that. So the first thing we can do is obviously get is an approved verb. We just want to quickly check that. So let's go and have a quick look. Yep, so get's an approved verb. Let's use get. So we're going to use get. Before we use get, let's just check if there's anything else that might be a bit more. I'm just thinking, just looking for anything else that might be a little bit more appropriate. Because you might be a get, but it also might be something else. All right, let's just use get. So we've got get URL links. Now the challenge was we needed to include other URLs. So we've got this variable called URL. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap it inside a param statement. That's going to be our first thing. I'm just having a quick think for a sec. Yes, we're going to do it this way. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a param statement like so, and we're going to wrap it inside that. So we're going to go URL like so, and we can actually go ahead and remove this line here because now we're actually accepting it as an input. So let's go ahead and do that. So the next thing we need to do is add basic function. Yep, to include this function should be able to query any domain name. Okay, cool. So essentially this URL now should be able to query any domain name. So essentially it's creating a variable called request. Yep. We need to append URL to the relative paths. It also helps if I can spell, but anyway. Including absolute path. So what this is doing is it's testing for a relative path, and if it is, it's just going to append an absolute to it, so we don't have any shenanigans. Now it's going to iterate through each of the links and call the respective URL, and then we're going to do it again. Now one thing you can actually see here, we've actually got I'm just looking at this code. So this code is being reused again. So I'm like, we can actually put that inside a function as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to merge. I'm still going to work out the name, but essentially we're going to merge. It's testing for the relative path. Yep. So what we can do what we're going to do is we can create a function called test relative path. But the thing is, essentially it's doing the same code here. So you can see here this code is exactly the same as this code. Essentially what it's doing is just concatenating the URL and the absolute path, or the relative path. So what we're going to need to pass into it is the relative path. And we're not going to actually pass in the URL because the URL is going to be called, the URL variable will cascade into the functions, this function scope. So what we're going to do is we're going to go format absolute URL. We're going to create a function called format absolute URL, and what we're going to do here is we're just going to make sure that format is an approved verb. Do not use the following reserved verbs aliases. These verbs are used by the PowerShell language or special case provided by. What? I can't use format. Arranges objects in a specific form. Yes, we can. It is essentially we're formatting it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to again create another param block, like so. What we're going to pass in here is we're just going to pass in the URL actually, which is all we need to do is pass in the URL. So essentially what we can do now is we can actually do our test. So we need to test for a relative path. Actually, we can just go ahead and copy all this out. So what's it doing here? It's write output. So what we can do here is we can go test for relative path. If the path is not like HTTP, we're going to need to change that to URL. Change that to URL. So if path is not like HTTP and URL is not like HTTPS, append the URL to the relative path, and then we're going to write output. So now we've formatted it, we can actually do this. So instead of having to have that code, all we need to do is just do this. Now we can actually improve this code and just basically pipe it, but for the time being, this is this will work fine. So essentially now what we can do is we can go ahead and clean up, refactor this code. If it's a relative path, append the original URL to it. We actually don't even need this, and what we can actually do here, so we can actually get rid of this code, and what we can actually do here is we can grab format absolute URL and do this. And so what that is it'll call that function with the URL, and it's just going to format it for us, so we don't actually have to deal with any sort of shenanigans, which is going to make it a little easier. So what we can have happen here now is just looking for URL, and I'm going to replace it with just the lowercase to make it a little bit better. And essentially what we're going to do here is we've got format absolute URL, which is URL, and then we need to format it. Where was it? It was here. So what we need to do here is we can go URL, and then we can just pipe the current URL to it. So that's basically it. So let's go ahead and run that and work out whether this is going to work. So we've now run it. It's loaded into memory. So let's now call get URL links, and we're going to specify https google.com. Let's see what we get out. So while we're doing that, just want to make sure it's going to return. Yep, it should return. Now it's taken its sweet time because obviously we are interacting with API. Oh, there we go. URL hostname could not be passed. Okay, so there's essentially, okay, so some things are not right with this. So we're obviously going to need to debug this. So what we can do now is, let's quickly grab this, drop that down there. We're going to drop a breakpoint on that, and let's go ahead and rerun this. And let's step in. Let's make sure that we have a request. Yep. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to have a look at the enumerated links. Oops. Actually, we're just going to quickly step into this format absolute URL. So let's have a look, make sure that it's passing in correctly. Yep, so that's that. So that's working. So what we're going to do now is I'm just going to drop a breakpoint down here. We're just going to step over all that. I'm going to have a quick squiz at the enumerated links. So it seems like it's not fully working. So what we're going to quickly do is we're going to stop it, and we're going to drop a breakpoint on here and see what's going on within that. So now if we rerun our code, let's go ahead, run it. Okay, we're in here. Let's have a quick look at what it's going on here. Okay, so you can see how the URL is not working. This is the issue what we're having now is with the scope. And this is we're using the URL and the scope. And this is the fun part is that we've broken rule. We're in currently in this we're in rule number 3, and there is an issue with this. What we've done is we're basically wanting to access this variable, but because we've set the variable locally, the variable is always going to be the relative. It's always going to be the relative path. So we need to actually access the parent one, but because we don't need to actually change any sort of scope, what we can do is let's just call this parent, like so. So essentially what we're doing here is I've created another parameter called parent, and we'll just call it parent URL, and we're going to add that URL to it, because what's happening is this is the relative path. It's setting itself as a relative path. So now if we set that, that will fix that, and all we need to do here is set our parent URL to URL, which is this variable in the parent scope, and then within here we can actually then do it. So if I just update that as well, that should work. Just format absolute URL. We might need to fix this up. Actually, no, we won't. Okay, so essentially what we can do now is if we go ahead and rerun this code again, and let's step in, let's hit run. Let's have a look at this line here. So now this line should actually be the full URL path. Yep, there we go. Sweet. So now we can just go ahead and let's just remove all the breakpoints, and let's see what we get as an output. So that's, like I said, so PowerShell scopes are very, very important. It's always really important to actually be watching where and how you're actually using your variables and scopes. And that, in this instance, we broke rule number 3 because we basically were using a same variable, but essentially we're using the same variable. But what's happening is since we're using the same variable, rule number 3 basically states, if we go back up to rule number 3, items changed within the scope change where they were created. Since we've changed it, it'll only change here, and we can't then reference the parent variable. So what we can do here now is let's just have a quick look. So we've got still some issues. So let's go ahead and work out what these issues are. Now it's probably going to pertain to this specific item. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a breakpoint there. Let's go ahead and rerun our code. Alright, certificates are valid, that's fine. So we got user URL google.com. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a watch here. Let's go add a watch. So I'm just going to have a look at what is going on there. So we're just going to continue to step. Oh. Oh, okay. The reason why we need to change that to a $_ and let's see if that fixes it. So let's go ahead and rerun it, because what I was doing is I'm formatting the URL according to itself, so that's never going to work. Oh, hang on. So we've got the original URL. Whoa, I've just made a big boo-boo. It needs to be in here. So essentially what we need to do is this. So original URL, which is URL, and then we've got the absolute. We need to format the absolute URL to the enumerated URL. So that's my bad, because what I was doing is this property was never going to change, and I was updating the wrong property. So let's go ahead and restart that and see what happens. Again, if you got questions via what we've covered today, definitely throw them in chat. Look at that. There we go. All right, so that's basically concluded for part one. Oh, sorry, for basic functions. So you can see here, let's just quickly stop and we'll quickly reiterate what we've done. So obviously we need to convert this into a function. But actually, the key test here is we've just used get URL links for Google. Let's change it to Yahoo. Let's use Facebook. Let's see what happens with Facebook. Let's go ahead and run it. It's just Facebook. Okay, that was a bad example. Let's try Yahoo because it's really bad. The certificate's invalid, so it's HTTPS. So it's running. While we're waiting for that, so essentially what we've done is we've refactored this code into a functions, and we've obviously refactored it as further by actually creating a nested, also by creating a separate function to format the absolute URL path, so that we don't have any relative paths. So essentially, you can see it's pretty much just straight copy and paste, and we just needed to make some small parameter adjustments. So now that's completed, and it's only returned one item. Well, that's fun. Why was that? That should work. There could be others. There could be other things there, but essentially, we need to move on. So what we're going to do is let's just leave it there for the time being, and we will head on to the next thing. So what I'm going to do is we're going to have a quick intermission. I'm going to take a quick break. Everyone can stretch their legs for a couple of minutes. We're going to have a relatively short break. It was going to be a little longer, but I am running out of time. I literally have 40 minutes to talk about part one for advanced functions, which is definitely not going to be enough time. So let's take a break. Everyone stretch your legs, and we'll be back in, let's give it, let's say at 10:21. All right. Alrighty, we are back. We are back. Okay, so advanced functions part 1. We have literally 30 minutes, 39 minutes to do part 1, which I don't think is going to happen. I think I'm going to cut it short anyway because I think yeah, I want to be able to make sure you guys get across all of this. Alright, so part 1. We're going to talk about the 3 types of functions. Now, most of the time, it's admittedly there's only like the community generally we just kind of talk about 2, and we kind of don't really talk about as pipeline functions essentially as the the third type, but essentially they're technically this is from the Microsoft material, the 3 types of functions. So essentially we have a basic function. So what we just did before was a basic functions, which is, you can see here, we've got a function name param. So essentially that is really it. It's pretty basic. Has very limited functionality. Pipeline functions are essentially the second type of functions. Now they generally we kind of group these in together more than just keeping them separate. But essentially, a pipeline function it accepts pipeline input. So it's a slight extension on the previous basic function. So you still have all the basic functions. You can specify parameters and things like that. But essentially, you can also accept a pipeline input. So you can actually have, essentially here, you can have your commandlet, and then you can pipe it into your function name. Now, you can still obviously use your parameters. That's all still appropriate. That's all fine. But essentially, it's you're accepting pipeline input. The third type of function is essentially advanced function. It's all that other stuff. Essentially, it's more of a PowerShell commandlet. Essentially, you have all those other goodies. So you can have your parameters. You have all the other. You can have should process, things like that. And obviously it also accepts parameter inputs. Essentially, it's building on the functionality on the previous type of function. Essentially, that's a PowerShell function. It is, and it's basically it as a basic summary. So where's my presenter view? There it is. Cool. Does anything else? Yeah. So it has parameter validation, comment-based help, things like that. So anyway, so we're now going to talk about commandlet binding. So with an advanced function, you are going to specify the commandlet binding attribute. And what commandlet binding attribute is, essentially it's an attribute that makes the function behave as a compiled commandlet. And it contains some very, very interesting attributes. So it has the confirm impact and should supports should process attributes, and essentially these attributes add the confirm and what if functionality to your function. You also have the default parameter set names, and basically default parameter set names essentially is a you can specify a default parameter set that PowerShell will process. We're going to look at all these, so that will help. You can have a help URI, so essentially you can have a URI help to an online topic. So basically, when you use the online get help online, it'll use that as its URL to actually go and browse to. You have supports paging. So what that does is it adds the parameters skip, first, and include total count. These are used for querying really, really, really big data sets. So that's what they are used for. Then you also have positional binding. So positional binding essentially is the positioning of a PowerShell parameter. So by default, it's enabled. So what it means is that if you disable it, you have to manually specify your parameter and where its position is. So for example, if you've got get child item, GCI, you'd have file, you have path, and then you have literal path, essentially you would have to declare these parameters and specify their exact position. So this would be position 0, this would be position 1. So that's essentially positional binding. When parameters are not positional, so they're named, the parameter name, so when it's being disabled, you have to explicitly set it. When it's been enabled, you don't. PowerShell basically doesn't really care. Most of the time, you don't really need this. It's good to have it, but generally you don't really use it. I haven't really had to set it, so it's just good to have though. So commandlet binding also adds verbose and debug switches within the function, so you can actually call it. So let's go ahead and let's clear all our ink and jump into a demo. Discard. Let's see what demos we have here. Commandlet binding. Okay, cool. So this is the very first one here. We can actually see this is the commandlet binding. So we've got our function. We're just going to call it advanced function, and we've added the commandlet binding attribute. And you can see here there's nothing within it. So we haven't added any sort of other attributes within it. It's just the commandlet binding. But by adding that, we get the right verbose and debug switches are made available. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to comment it out so we can quickly run this first and we can see that. So if we run advanced function, oh my gosh, it helps ADVS. You can see those parameters are not available. If we run verbose, there's nothing there. It doesn't actually enable those functions, those switches. But now, if we actually rerun it and we reload that in memory, I'm just going to do. You can see now that tab complete worked, and now we actually get our right verbose out. So it's very, very handy. Now we can actually use right debug as well. So there's debug, and obviously we can use them interchangeably. But the commandlet binding attribute will add those switches to your advanced function. Now we're going to now talk about should process and confirm impact. This is really, really cool. This is one of the coolest things I love about PowerShell and its ability to it's really cool features. Excuse me. So let's go ahead and run that. So essentially, back in the day when you used command prompt and you had those questions, are you sure you wanted to do this functionality? They were literally hard-coded prompts that you had to use. PowerShell is done away with that. You don't actually need to use that. And essentially what it does is you can actually wrap code that you deem that you want to require a prompt for, or have set a prompt. So essentially what you have here is it basically allows a user prompt to test before a key action. So a key action, we'll just use that terminology. And essentially what you can do is, obviously if you're making a change, and it will prompt. Now we're going to talk about the confirm impact in a second, but essentially you can make it prompt. Are you sure you want to do this? With the other shoe on the other foot, you also add the functionality for what if. And what if is really good, because what if allows you to emulate your commandlet before actually running it allows you to test your changes before actually committing up, before actually running them live. So so what if is really good for example, if you've got this really big one-liner script to delete a whole bunch of users from Active Directory, and before you do that, you probably just want to what if that remove 80 user, just to make sure that what you're doing is that there's no issues with your script. So what if it really allows you to test those actions before actually performing them? So should process and confirm impact are really, really, really cool. So I'm going to quickly talk about the confirm impact. Now, confirm impact is something that it's going to just I had to actually relearn because I had the wrong way around. But essentially, the way that PowerShell works is that when you launch a console, the confirm preference automatic variable is automatically set. And the confirm preference variable basically by default is set to high. And just FYI, it's by default set to high. But essentially what this variable is used to do is define what level of prompts or confirm prompts are required by the user. So essentially, when you have PowerShell, for example, here you have the PowerShell console set to high, confirm preferences set to high, and in our function we've set the confirm impact to set to low. It's not going to prompt. The way that it works is that if the confirm preference variable matches the confirm impact variable or is greater, then it will prompt. So for example, you can see here we have the confirm preference is set to low, and then within our function we have a confirm impact to be high. The confirm impact will then prompt because the console is lower than the actual impact. Now, if we set the confirm preference to be high by default, this is how PowerShell works here. By default, confirm preference is set to high. It will still prompt. Now, we're going to talk about the confirm impact preferences in a second, but it's just really important to understand that essentially the reason why you want to do this is because let's say you've got a server. You might want to set the confirm impact, the confirm preference variable to be low, so that you're getting prompted for all those really important prompts, just to make sure you're not doing something destructive. Whereas on your local desktop, you might want to set it to high, because it's the risk is not as bad. So it really is a really awesome way to be able to mitigate risk, especially in high risk environments with PowerShell. Very, very cool. I've included a whole bunch of sources. I'm just going to quickly chat them to you guys now. But these are really, really, really good. Did that actually do it? I don't think it did. No, it's just one line at all. Okay, I'm just going to do separate lines, 2 secs. Separate chats. So that one, and that one. So essentially, that's what the confirm impact is. Now, let's quickly talk about the implementation. So, of what a confirm impact is. So essentially, confirm impact describes the destructiveness level of your of an action. So for example, let's say you've got a file that you want to delete from the temp directory. Well, that should be probably a confirm impact of low, because at the end of the day though, it's a temp directory. It's not something that is really of that concern. However, if you're doing a format, for example, let's say you're doing a disk format, that would be an impact of high, because the destructiveness is high. Are you sure you want to do this? Because once you do it, there's no one going back. And that's really the level of how it works. So essentially you have high, medium, low. So high should always be confirmed. It will always prompt. This medium should be confirmed in most scenarios. So most of the time you have a confirm impact of high on a server. So on the server, you have a high impact on a client. You're not going to get prompt for this. But if you set a confirm preference to be medium, you will get prompt for all these. So again, yes, it should be confirmed in most scenarios. And then a low is basically it'll prompt unless the user explicitly declares it. So if you really want to do it. And then none, don't even prompt. So essentially that's your the levels of confirm impact. So let's have a quick look at that in a demo, because demos are great. So let's have a look at confirm impact. So here we have a I'm just going to trash my PowerShell session. And first thing we're going to do is let's let's take a quick look at the confirm preference. So if we run this, we can see what our confirm preference is, and you can see by default it's set to high. So we've got an advanced function here that we've got, and what we've done is we've got our commandlet binding, and you can see inside here each of these attributes is basically these attributes are declared and they're separated by a comma. So we have our confirm impact to be medium and a support should process to be true. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have a quick look at support should process, but before we do that, actually no, we're going to have a look at that now. So essentially, the way that we implement support should process is, where is it? Did I actually edit? Yeah, here it is. Actually, I actually didn't even mention it. So we'll quickly go here. The way we implement it is we declare the support for should process in the commandlet binding, and then once we've done that, we then wrap the the PS commandlet should process method around our key code. So you can see here in a quick demo, we can see we've declared the support should process, and that is a real tongue twister, in the actual commandlet binding as the attribute when we set our confirm impact to be medium. And then in here we have our actual should process method declared, and you can see it's a script block. So we've basically got, we've got an if statement, and then we've basically wrapped we've nested the code that we considered high risk inside that if statement. Now the should process has a few overloads. So you can see here we've got there's a few overloads to the method. We're only going to look at we're going to look at a couple of them. We're just going to look at the first three. The fourth, it's kind of a bit too much. But essentially, these parameters describe how we're going to basically do that. So essentially, we can see here we've got our overload number 3, which is this one here. So we've got the verbose description, the verbose warning, and the caption. So essentially the verbose description is a textual description of the action to be performed. This will be displayed to the user on the action preference continue. So these are just basically parameters that you pass into the you pass into the method essentially. And what this method does is it will basically return a true or false, and it will then action it as accordingly. But this is the method that will handle the prompt and all the what if. So you just call the method and it'll do what it needs to do. So, and what we're going to do is I'm actually going to var and just to show that it's just a method, we can actually just go ahead and wrap that. It's just going to return or a true or a false, like so. But essentially you wrap it because it's returning a true or false, or null, not null, excuse me, value. And then from that you can just go from there. So obviously the code that's inside that if statement is obviously protected. It's our key code. So let's so obviously you have other overloads here, but essentially it just describes how to use those specific methods. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and run this. So we're going to run this, F8 it, and we are going to actually going to just drop a breakpoint on it. Just going to drop a breakpoint on it, and then I'm just going to put a return here so we can actually have a look at this. So what we can do now is we're going to call our advanced function. We don't need to specify any parameters, it's all optional, so we're going to go ahead and call it now. So we've called it and we've hit this breakpoint. So what we're going to do is just step through, and I just want to we're going to have a look at what the output is. Let's add a quick watch. And you can see it's just a true or false. So essentially this method will equate to true or false if it's if you specify if you have a confirm impact of what's greater than what's set by the greater or equal to what's set by the confirm preference. that will prompt, or alternatively, if you have a what if, that'll prompt us. It'll throw a what if warning up. Essentially, that's pretty much it. So cool. All right. So I'm just going to shift F5 that. We're going to terminate that because I just wanted to have a look at that. This method. That's why we use it inside of a use it inside of our if statements. So anyway, so let's go ahead and rerun this. So you can see we're going to call our advanced function like so, and you can see here it's actually gone ahead and it's run those overloads. So we had an overload of 3 and 4 declared, and you can see it just went ahead and ran it. And the reason why is because the confirm preference that we have set is medium. And what's our confirm preference? It's high. And because it's lower than what's actually set by the preference, it's not going to prompt. However, we're going to actually now, if we change the preference to low, that's when things are going to get fun. But before we do that, let's actually call the function using what if. So now if we call our function using what if, you can see it says performing operation display right host target computer name, performing operation advanced function on target computer name. So essentially those so it's by so essentially what's going to happen now is essentially it's executed that method, and that method now has written that what if to the screen. It knows that you've specified the what if switch, and then it just presents it to the screen. So and that's essentially all you need to do to actually make your code really to make your code use the confirm and what if. But now let's actually force a prompt so we can actually see the prompting element work. So we're going to change our confirm preference to force the prompt. So we're now pretending that we're a server. This is a server now. We're on a PowerShell console on the server, and we're now going to call advanced function. So if we call advanced function again, you can see it's now actually prompting. So we can see, you sure you want to perform this action, performing operation, display right host on target computer name. Yep, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it. And you can see it's actually it's actually executing that code. We can see there's our overload 3 being printed. So essentially, that is you confirm. That's how you can see our confirm prompt. Now the final part here is we can actually overwrite that. So let's say you have automated code and you don't want it to prompt. We can actually just use the confirm. Since we're using the confirm switch, we can actually specify the false value to enforce that it's not going to set. So if we go ahead and rerun it, you can see there it's just gone ahead and executed the code. It's on the same. It's on a lower. The action preference is higher than the confirm preference, so it should prompt, but that will override it. So essentially, that will suppress it. So that's essentially commandlet binding. So if you've got any questions, throw them in. And we'll keep going. So the next one we have is the default parameter set. So essentially what the default parameter set is it's basically, it allows you to control, essentially it allows you to control which parameters are presented to the user. So if we think about get child item, you have get child item, literal path, and path. They're two of the same inputs, but they do different things. So they would basically be on different parameter sets. And essentially what we would have there is those parameters, the default parameter set would be the path. So you can actually control which ones you want to be displayed to the user by default. So essentially that's really it. Parameter sets require a name. So you require to be able to, you need to set a name. That name can be anything. That name could be, cat, dog, tree, whatever. Obviously giving it something meaningful is actually really useful. And then you use the default parameter name attribute to control the default parameter by specifying the parameter set name. So, and the definition is essentially exactly what it looks like there. So we have default parameter set equals name. So let's actually go ahead and demo that. So what I want you to do is ignore all this. This is something that we're going to cover a little bit later, but essentially this is our default parameter set. So we have two parameter sets here. We have standard and other. So essentially, we have two sets of parameters. I'm not going to kind of go any I'm not going to go any further with that. We have standard and other. And here we can basically specify standard. So this function has two parameter sets, like I said. The first is param1 and param2. So if we look at our params, we've got param1, param2, and param3. And essentially, the second is param1 and param3. The reason why is because these are on different parameter sets. We're going to talk about that later. But essentially, I just want you to recognize it. And what we're wanting to focus on is the default parameter set name. So what we can do here is, let's go ahead and execute this code. And you can see here, if we call advanced function, and we're going to specify the default parameter set. So I'm just going to, by using the default parameter set, it will default to the first parameter set, which is standard, and that is param1 and param2. Those are the two parameters. So all I need to do here is just go tab, tab, and you can see that is the default parameter set that it's applied. Now we can go ahead and execute it. Missing blah blah blah. I don't know what it's wanting. Okay, it's requiring some other bits and pieces. Okay, I think it requires a mandatory, but that's fine. Essentially, that's your default parameter set. So now if we actually go advanced function, let's just clean that up, and we go param1, and then we go param3, that you see I had to double tap to actually get to it. So essentially, yeah, that's the second parameter set. Now let's go ahead and we can actually change that. Let's actually change that, and we can actually show you that it will default to the other one. So we've changed the default parameter set now to other. So if we go ahead and rerun that, and we rerun advanced function. So we're going to get param1, and if we do it again, it's going to go to param3 this time. Oh, what? I should have gone to param3. Is it other? Yeah, that should have gone to param3. Oh well. But essentially, it's the default parameters that gets processed. Now, one of the things that's really cool is if you want to get the current parameter set name, you can do that by calling the ps commandlet variable and then referencing the parameter set name. Now, for some reason, this is not calling. So what we're going to do, we're just going to put some variables in here so that it's not going to have an issue. So if we want to see what the default parameter set name is, we can actually go param1, let's just go A, and you can see it's standard. So if we change that to 2, you can see it's changed to other, and that's essentially the parameter set. Now watch this. If we actually go parameter 2, it can't be resolved. And this is really the cool thing about parameter sets, is you can actually control which parameter sets get made available to the user. So essentially, that's parameter sets. It's just basically the default parameter set name. It just controls the default parameter that's basically the parameter set that's getting displayed to the user. Alrighty then. What else do we have? It's 10:50. Well, we're going to probably wrap it up there for today. I think supports paging and all that can wait till next week. I think we're going to wrap it up there for today. Questions. Does anybody have questions? If you've got questions, throw them in the chat. I'm going to now drag all the way up to that. So, as you can see, there's a lot of other bits and pieces to go through. So, does anyone have any questions? So essentially, we're going to probably leave it there for today. It's definitely a little short because we kind of got caught up with the debugging. But essentially, next week what we'll be covering is obviously part 2, and we'll probably be just doing that. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Definitely is a lot more of a challenging topic to talk about and obviously learn about because there is so much in it. So what we're probably going to do is we're going to leave it there for today. Any questions, throw them up on Twitter, or you can throw them up on the Discord server. Doesn't matter. It's all good. And I hope to see you guys next time. Anyway, bye for now.